Other. That's really what we need to do is build a community.
Yeah, that's our plan.
Hey, we are on.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fifth podcast of Black and White. Let's talk. We are delighted to be here again. This is just a real pleasure. And hello to Robert and Dan. So, this is a new podcast featuring Robert Johnson, pastor of St. Mark Church, Wichita, Kansas, Dan Stockamer, founder of Prairie Hill Vineyard, a lovely venue a few miles west of Wichita, and me, Jan Fox Peterson, former school psychologist, current relationship coach, and restorative justice advocate. Tonight, we are discussing relationships, how we build them and maintain them, and transformation and resurrection. But before we get started, we always want to give credit to our friends in the band, Sometimes on Sunday, for giving us permission to play their song, Love is All Around. For love is all around despite everything, despite all the chaos, despite all the trouble that we see around us, love is here. And that is the premise of our podcast. So Dan, Robert, and I seek to foster a more civil, compassionate, and just society, building bridges and not walls. We seek to hear stories of everyday people doing extraordinary things. There is a lot of good going on out there. So our quote to set the tone for the evening is by James Baldwin from his nonfiction book, The Fire Next Time. James Baldwin was a brilliant Black American writer, producing essays, novels, plays, and poems in the 50s through the 80s until he passed in 1987. So he said, I love a few people, and they love me. And some of them are white. And isn't love more important than color? So our premise truly is that we want to promote goodness, love, grace, mercy, unity, connection, all the good. Sometimes we got to talk about the things that aren't so great, though, to get to the good. So tonight, we want to have a conversation about the intersection of psychology, where's my area of expertise, and theology, and how those all connect to build better relationships. So for me, through Dan and Robert and Phil Stacy and other friends I have, I am getting more open to actually considering the Bible as an important part of my life. Prior to that, I have really seen the Bible used as a weapon to decide who's right and wrong. It really hasn't been to promote love. It's been more to promote divide. That has been my experience. But tonight, I really do want to hear from Dan and Robert about their view of the biblical premises, the richness of it, and how, if you're really following it, what it really has to say about relationships, love, and all the things that is in opposition of the violence that we see in society. Not just physical violence, but the verbal violence, the divide, the whole idea that if we have differences, I have every right to demonize you, call you names, label you, all those kind of things. And we have seen that come from all aspects of all different walks of life, from Christians, people who say that they're Christians, as well as people who say they're not. It's just really messy. So I would really like to hear from you guys, your approach from the biblical point of view. And I am really working to open my heart, to come with an open heart and open mind to hear your perspective. So
You the first shot at it, that's for sure.
Well, you were muted, so what I missed.
I said, Robert, that's a tall order, so I'm letting you take it first if you would like it.
Okay, I'll jump in. So I'll start here. So let me just say, and I appreciate you inviting us into this conversation, this convergence of psychology and theology, and then to talk about the Bible and to give due consideration to the fact that the Bible has been abused and has been used as a weapon. But is there another way? So I'll start out my part of the conversation. Let me read you all let me quote myself. like, I know that comes across as super arrogant, but I'm really not. I'm really not trying to be. I don't want Braxton, the young man who's helping us tonight, to think that there's this arrogant pastor. I'm only reading my own quote because, like, I just thought I got something a little right, and I don't want to try to waste time. So here it is. It says one of the things I wish I could convince the global church and anyone who ever picks up a Bible is to not read the Bible looking to win an argument, prove a point, legitimate an opinion, or to see who's right and who's wrong. If you approach the Bible in either one or more of these ways, you'll be on the wrong path from the very beginning. And all of your interpretations will be perversions or dangerous twists of truth. Instead, approach the Bible with an openness to encounter the divine, to encounter eternity, to explore what it means to be fully human, to live in God's creation. And if you do this, then the Bible will come alive for you and you will find it riveting, radically insightful, and deeply transformative. Furthermore, instead of seeing the Bible as boring, oppressive, divisive, and restrictive, you will see that actually it's relevant, liberating, unifying, and expansive. So that's my basic premises, basic thought about the Bible, and we can dig into what I mean. That's a lot to unpack, but I'll kind of speak from that place and dig into how that applies to what the Bible has to say about relationships, which I think is some of the most profound stuff that's ever been said about relationships.
Well, I was like, did you write that book for me? I'm beginning to wonder. Um, so part of my concern, so so I think what we're really trying to do is just in so many ways to reduce extremism. I think that I honestly have been in more of an extreme place in that I just shut my mind. I shut my mind to the biblical perspective and really have focused in on the psychological perspective, what we've learned from neuropsychologists. And there's a lot of wonderful information that has come out in the last 10 years, especially on trauma, how it affects the brain, how it affects acquisition of academic skills and behaviors, emotional regulation, and all that. And my concern is I don't, I want to move forward and learn. I have a lot to say about relationships and how to build and maintain them through the psychological point of view. But where I'm really in my journey now is I want to add the richness of the biblical perspective. And what I would like to see is that the church do the same. So the extremism, it for me is here I've been over here only acknowledging psychology and science. That's where I've been. And I see so much of the church missing out on growth and change and getting better because they're on this extreme over here saying only the Bible is where you get wisdom for life. So we have these two extremes that I understand well, but where I really realize I am missing out personally. And I think our whole community, the church community, the community as a whole is missing out too, because it's not an either or. You can have big time faith and richness through faith and also embrace what we're learning in psychology and science. Dan, you got to unmute. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Years ago, I met a man by the name of Bob Richards. He was on the cover of the Wheaties boxes when I grew up. He was a pole vaulting guy. I just read to see where he was. He passed away this year in February at 97 years old. But I met him back in the 80s. And he had done a thing called Heart of America, and I was getting involved in it. And I took him to a group meeting and a church meeting. And at the end of that church meeting, he looked at me and he says, Dan, I've known lots of church leaders, these big pastors through the years. And he said, many of them are paranoid schizophrenics. And I looked at him and I sort of went, whoa, he's calling some of these guys paranoid schizophrenics. Well, what happens when you get a guy that's a paranoid schizophrenic, and because he's charismatic and because he can memorize the Bible and knows how to whip a crowd up, he can get a whole group of people lined up behind him and behind his paranoia. And pretty soon he's spouting all kinds of things that just don't even have anything to do with the heart of the scriptures, because it's coming out of his own mental instability. So we have to be careful who we listen to. And when it comes to the scriptures, you really just need to read them for yourself and see how they speak to you. Psalm 119 to me is so beautiful. And all of these, there's no doubt that the scriptures are the most read book in history, the oldest books in history, a group of books. And so most people recognize that it's good to know what's in there, because much of our heritage is based upon an understanding of such simple, basic things, for example, is what the Passover is, what happened, for example, why we celebrate Easter, what is all of this about? And I was drawn into it. I was drawn into it after I had a hallucinogenic experience in a closet when I was 19 years old, seeking God. And I walked around for weeks afterwards asking people if they knew what it was to be born again, because I didn't know what had happened to me. And so I was then, when I read in Ephesians at a fellowship I was taken to, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that you may know what is the hope of his calling and what the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints. That verse blew my mind. I said, I want to have the eyes of my understanding being enlightened. And so I from that point, and that was back in 1970, I've been endeavoring to have the eyes of my understanding being enlightened. And perhaps one of the most enlightening things that's come up in my life just in the last year or two, three, is the understanding of how judgmental, prejudicial, is that a word? And just downright mean-spirited many Christians are toward those that don't think the way they do. And that has bothered me to the point that that's what's really coming out of this whole podcast is, can we please agree that just because you don't think the way I do, that doesn't mean you're a bad person or I'm a bad person in the sense that we are evil. We just have a view that we've developed over the years, many times because our mom and dad believe that way. And if mom and dad believe it, well, it's got to be good enough for me too. And so then finally, when maybe you finally find some cracks in mom and dad's theology, then you go, well, God, and would you please teach me? And the biggest prayer I think I ever prayed that had the most impact on my life was when I really got honest, and I just said, well, that verse in Psalms, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me, was impactful because I spoke that from my heart. And through that, I think when I said, Lord, I really do want to become more like you. Would you please teach me how to be more like you from a sincere heart? Well, my life has changed since then because he's revealing to me all kinds of things that I hadn't considered before. And I really think then that that's one of the reasons I'm drawn into doing this podcast is, like, for example, Robert, I know you have a deep theological background and a really solid training. And I'm interested in knowing what I can learn from you. Jan knows more about psychology. How do you help somebody that's a narcissist that runs a church or somebody, God forbid, and it all happens too often where there is sexual abuse going on in the church by people that say they know God. Or if you really want to get into it, the Pharisees knew the scriptures literally by heart. The Old Testament, they knew that stuff. And somehow with all that Bible in their head, they still managed to crucify the very one that the whole scriptures prophesied of. So what's going on in the heart of people has to be corrected somehow, because that doesn't take, I guess we land back up on 1 Corinthians 13, you can do all of these things, speak in tongues, you can have miracles, you can give your body to be burned, you can do all of this stuff for a religious sake, for God's sake, for my sake. But if it's not done in charity and in love, it doesn't do anybody any good, you or anybody else. And so I think we have to draw all of my heart, your heart, back to love and start there. Because if God is love, which we all agree, I think, then love is God. And so we have to agree on one thing, that we want to become more loving. And let's take it from there. So that's my thought, Robert.
Well, I just have to say that I have run into people who say they're Christian who don't believe what you just said. Like when I have tried to say, is not the theology, the whole background of Christianity, God is love. I've had people push back and say God is a God of judgment. So we're not even on the same page that God is a God of love. And they would say, well, love is judgment too. So even that in itself is controversial for some people.
So let me say this, and I think this is very important. And I'm going to make a big statement, but it's true. Like, this is literally true. Most people who live under Christendom, most people who wear the name Christian, have never really read the Bible. Yes, the Bible has been the best-selling book of all time, but that doesn't mean people read it.
Yeah.
Number two, it doesn't mean that they understood what they read, because the Bible is not so simple that you can just pick it up and read it in that sense. Some parts are, but not most parts aren't. You've got to understand historical context. You got to understand the purpose for which it was written. And number three, most people don't even understand what it really means to be Christian. So Jan, the people that you're talking to, they may have religious knowledge. They may have knowledge that's, whether you want to label it Christian, but they don't know, these people, they don't know the heart of Christ. And I'm not talking some external resource. I'm talking about the Gospels. If you just read the Gospels, you can't find anywhere in the Gospels where Jesus is walking around preaching doctrine. You can't find anywhere in the gospel where Jesus is going around beating up on people because of their sins or failures. You don't find that. That is all Christendom. That's stuff that's been attached to Jesus by people. And so one of the first things I do, particularly with young people, Jan, is tell them, look, of course the church has been abusive. And we all from different perspectives. As an African American, I can tell you that about the abuse of the church, how the folks who created the institution of slavery in America were Christians. They were Christians from the other continent. They came here seeking religious liberty, but then they turned right around and helped create the system of slavery. So there are all kinds of abuses. And I don't judge those people, because I think everybody takes their journey. I'm just saying that most people have never really read the Bible. They've never really studied Jesus, and they don't understand or know what the essential Christian message is. And one more thing, Janet. So, for example, the essential message of Jesus was not a doctrine. Jesus, in the Gospel of Mark, in the Gospel, when it says Jesus begins his ministry and he begins to proclaim the good news that he came to bring, the good news wasn't, you've got to believe this, or you've got to do this, or you've got to, here's the system. He said, there is a new community here. That's what community. There's a new way to do relationship. There's a new way to be in relationship with other people that's radically different from what you've experienced from the Roman Empire and all the other places where you've learned about relationship. There's a new way to be human and a new way to be in community. And it's all based in self-sacrificial love. That is the essential message of Jesus. But you hardly hear that from the pulpits of our churches. You hardly hear that in Bible studies. And you hardly hear that from people who go around saying that God is a God of judgment. That's of course, there's judgment in life. There's accountability in life, but you can't define God in that way. So I just wanted to say that, because there's so much distortion of the Bible and of Jesus. And that's part of what I do, Jan, is try to be an apologetic in the sense of correcting a lot of distortion of who Jesus is and what the Bible is.
And that's awesome. And I think, what is troubling to me is I've been in some churches where they really are talking poorly of the secular world without holding the church accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And what I see in both the church and the secular is this walking around in this, and I'm going to psychology now, into this total unconscious living. Where
Absolutely.
you're just repeating the patterns
Absolutely.
and what you're just used to doing. And so for both, it's not working for the secular world, and it's not working for the church world.
Right.
So it's calling us all up into a higher level of consciousness where we're very intentional in identifying who it is that we are
Mm-hmm.
as individuals and a community, and then aligning our behaviors to that. Of course, we're never going to be perfect. That's why we need God's grace. And even though I have not been like an evangelical Christian and a biblical person, I still have followed and sought and prayed the Spirit. So I know that God, in His grace and His endless mercy, has always moved with me and walked with me and been with me.
Absolutely.
So I've deeply known that it's not my church attendance, it's not my biblical knowledge. It's always been about my heart and desiring to be a better human today than I was yesterday. And I constantly mess up, but that's where I deeply understand grace, mercy, forgiveness. But it's this just continuing and perpetuating in this unconsciousness. We're just going along with these patterns that they're just not serving us well.
Absolutely.
So much of the scriptures do talk about being kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. The whole focus of most of the epistles is the transformation of our heart into an expression of love, which it can be translated, in my thinking anyway, into walking in the Spirit. And the whole thing in Romans 8 says we are to walk in the Spirit, and that once you walk in the Spirit, you're no longer living in the flesh. In the sense, you're walking in relationship with the Spirit. Now, John says in 1 John that if we don't love our neighbor, we can't say we love God. We're liars. And then in that same epistle, he says, if you have no need of men that really teach you, because God, the Spirit, will teach you. So you really do have to, and I think that's where we tend to lift up our spiritual, quote unquote, leaders in a way that sometimes takes away our personal relationship with the Father. Because if I'm looking to Robert, not that I highly respect Robert's skill and him as a person, but if all I did was listen to Robert and not really keep my heart with the Father directly to him, I'm missing the whole purpose of this thing. And that's Robert's job, is to make sure that my heart is reaching up to him. And when you talked about Jesus's first sermon, I believe in Matthew 4, whatever, is the Beatitudes. I always love it because it's the be attitude, how we are to be. And the attitude that I am to be is poor in spirit, which is another way of saying broken, no pride, no leaven, in the sense that I've lost my puffed upness. And he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the pure of heart. All of it was focusing on the attitude and the being of that person. They're the ones that are going to be receiving a blessing. So then then we have, as Janet, as you know, so much problems, not only in society, in our schools and homes, everywhere, what's going on in our heart, so that how can we transform, back to that word, to become more like him through, and it says in Romans, through the renewing of our mind. So that means we have to start thinking differently. So then when it says whatsoever things are good, acceptable, lovely, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. I think he's trying to get us off of being so enmeshed in the negativity and the hatred of the world and coming out in a new way of living. And that to me then is where we ought to be focusing, because You can have a different theology. You can believe in water baptism or spiritual baptism or no baptism, and we can all agree to love. And just because you want to water baptize and I don't, who cares? Well, some people will say it's really important. And I said, well, it just so happens that my name, Dan, means God is judge. At least that's what I've learned. If God is judge, I'm going to let him do the judging. People say, well, when he comes back, we're going to see judgment. I said, fine. When Jesus comes back, he can judge all of the all of the hatred in the world, and all of the wars will end. But he'll take care of that. I'm here right now as his representative to reach out in love. And by all means, Janet, there's definitely, I needed counseling. Even though I came from a relatively healthy background, I certainly didn't think I needed counseling. But I think everybody benefits from somebody who has a professional background, who can then open your eyes of your understanding to see your behaviors that are leading to a destructive pattern in your life. And so, yeah, we need psychologists probably working with church leadership. Just one last thing about the word church in the book of Acts, and you know this, Robert, in Ephesus, when Paul went into Ephesus, they got all freaked out because he was telling people they didn't have to worship Diana of the Ephesians. And everybody made their money off of Diana of the Ephesians because it was like a sex god worship thing going on there in Ephesus. And they had a mob come together. The word mob in Acts is the same word ecclesia in the Greek as we get the word church. So all the word church is in the basic understanding of ecclesia, it's a group that's called out for a specific purpose.
That's it.
So we see the church as we identify it in America as, based upon our background, it's either a big building with a steeple on it, or we've got various different ideas from our background. But the true definition of that word in the scriptures is just people that have been called out for a purpose. And I see that purpose as to be an example of God's love in the world. So if the church isn't doing that, it's not doing its job. They've just become a mob.
And they're not doing it because they don't even know what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
There is absolute confusion and chaos. So let's talk purpose. Let's talk, Jan, your purpose, Dan, your purpose. If I don't know who I am, and I don't know what my gifts are, and I don't have a sense of why God may have placed me on earth in this moment, then I'm in total chaos.
Yeah.
That means I'm using whatever words and whatever terminologies and whatever fashions or styles that come around. I'm using those to define me, but I don't have a core sense of my being and why I'm here. And that is the church. The church is lost. And I know that's strong language because we are so disconnected from the founder of the church and what he meant and what he was up to when he came. And it's very simple, Jane. So when you say psychology and theology, of course, because that's where Jesus started. Because Jesus says, this is why I came. I came to bring a new way of living in community. He literally, when he says the kingdom has come, don't spiritualize that. Don't turn that into a religious term. A kingdom is basically a community. It's a way of people living together. And Jesus says there's a new kingdom and there's a new way to live together. And repent, you got to forget everything you've learned, and you've got to become like a child and be willing to learn how to do relationships all over again. So then, Jesus, what does that look like? Give us examples. Okay, here's an example. It begins inside your heart. For out of the heart flows the issues of life. Well, if it begins in the heart, that means that we've got to do some work on our minds, Jan, on our emotions and how we think. That it has to be that we can't change the world around us. We can't be in healthy relationships if we ourselves are in chaos. So Jesus says it has to begin with this inner work, but then it spreads. And he says, because then as you do that, that changes how you see the stranger. That changes how you see the person in prison. That changes how you see your spouse. That changes how you see gender. It changed, but it began. So it's both psychology, but it's also social. I mean, it's a social reality, and you can't separate them. They go together. That is the message that Jesus essentially, literally came to bring. And when I say that, people always, because they're like, no, it's got to be more, because they want this spooky religion. They want this kind of religion that they can freak out on and all of that. Well, if you want that, that's fine, but that's not what Jesus was doing. That is not what Jesus was doing. Jesus was doing simple stuff like going to people's wedding
Mhm. Right.
and not identifying himself, and they came to him and asked him to do something, and he served them, but he didn't go to the wedding trying to take over and be in charge. I'm the Christ. He just went to the wedding. He just went to Zacchaeus' house. He just sat at the table, and the woman who saw something special in him wanted to anoint his feet for burial. It's just like hanging out with people and valuing people's humanity. And he did it so well that even the most broken people felt human in his presence, and they wanted to be around him, not because of religious doctrine, but because they felt somebody value their humanity.
Well,
Yeah.
so the reason, I mean, I am revisiting all of this, and the reason I am so concerned about the direction of the church is all the disconnection and the lack of community.
Yeah.
I follow
Yeah.
Gabor Mate.
Yep.
He was a medical doctor following all the traditions of medicine and realizing it just wasn't working. And he really woke up to the body, mind, spirit, soul connection. And he's written a book. I'll have it right here. He's written a lot of books. The Myth and Normal is outstanding. But the one I'm thinking about, it's called Hold On to Your Kids, Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers. And so when you think about young people totally out there like in an ocean with no captain steering it, I mean that's scary, and that's what I see happening where adults just don't matter. There's not the respect anymore because there's just this lack of attachment with a caring, connected adult. And of course, and I'm not blaming the adults. I mean, the culture is such a mess. I mean, when you think you have to be so much more astute as a parent than ever when you think about all the distractions on media, the violence in movies, the gaming, the Snapchat, all of that, the distraction that pulls your kids away from you and your connection. And to have these peers where the peers are everything and the adults are nothing, that, there's been all kinds of studies. Like they did a study years ago where they separated some monkeys in a lab from their mother. And so to watch then what happened with those monkeys turning on each other, the neglect, the bullying, everything that went on. There was some elephants in the wild where there were so many elephants that they had to do something to control the population, and they killed off a couple of the fathers whose infants could maintain on their own. Well, those infants, as they grew in adolescence, these elephants, they demonstrated characteristics never seen in elephants normally. They started throwing sticks at rhinoceroses and stomping on them and killing them without the presence of the adult. And so how they fixed it, they put an adult leader within the mix to model how they were supposed to live in their world. And I feel like I see this in the schools on a daily basis. I mean, the schools are doing the very, very best they can, but society is so messy. It's not the kids' fault. I don't want to blame parents. I just want to erase blaming from our entire vocabulary. But what are we going to do? What is the church going to do to meet people's needs in a different way? I'm thinking about a story of a parent that needed to come into the school where I was a school psychologist. And because I had to have some paperwork signed, it's a special ed thing. And I mean, I had to have this paperwork signed. So by the time he got to me, he was probably at least an hour late. He apologized, but he said that he had gone to that same school, that high school himself as a young person. He sat out in his car for 30 minutes before he could get the courage to walk in. Has so traumatized. When he was young, he was thrown up against the lockers. I mean, he was bullied. He had just had a nightmare experience of abuse. So walking into the same place where all that abuse occurred. But what happened when he came in, we had a greeter at the door who greeted him warmly. He went to the secretary to check in, who greeted him warmly. He walked, my office was a ways away from the big opening of the building. These people just warmly greeted him. How are you doing? Is there anything I can do to help you? And then he meets me and sees my concern for his daughter. So I use that example because this is someone that had been abused in that environment of school. So to get him to go back into that school was all he could do. And I really feel like for someone like me who's experienced quite a bit of spiritual abuse, I'll just put it out there, but not as much as other people. I got neglect and some other things in my upbringing, but was not spiritually abused in my upbringing. It was through an experience later in life, about 10 years in this environment that I can talk about. But I don't want this. I want this podcast really to serve as a bridge builder. What can we offer people different? Because we can't get through this life alone. Our brains, here's the psychology, are hardwired for connection. So when we are isolated, no wonder the suicide rates are escalating. No wonder addictions, death by fentanyl. I mean, all these things that are happening, the violence, the shootings, and all of that. Because when we are so disconnected and we are not in community, it's our brains don't let us be healthy. It's nearly impossible. So my challenge for every person, any person of faith, what are we going to do differently to build bridges and to heal, to heal?
And whatever we do, and I'll just be real quick, Dan. Whatever we do, you're saying it, Jan. You've said it multiple times, and I just want to just affirm that it's about community. It is about community. And so when we say community, we're talking about, but community is built by relationships, right?
Yeah.
And so the disconnect of young people, the abuse, the spiritual abuse, everything you mentioned is a manifestation of broken community. And so whether we're talking about the church, whether we're talking about families, whether we're talking about our school systems, the challenge for me is how do we learn how to be human again? And you can't be human if you're not in community. Like we can't, to be human is to be in connection with other people. And so and as a faith person, for me, the guide for me as a Christian is Jesus, because I understand that that's exactly what he talked about. But I can talk about community without talking specifically about Jesus, because my understanding is that where community happens, that is the presence of the Lord.
Mm.
Where genuine, authentic, loving community happens, it's like what Jesus says, where two or three are gathered, I'll be. So what and he says in his name, well, in his name means that they're gathered and they're living and treating each other in the way that he called for, self-sacrificial, uh, going the extra mile, being gracious, being kind. Like where people are doing that, he says, I'm there. Right. And so church folks get so focused on, we want to usher in the presence of God. Well, if you want to usher in the presence of God, go love your wife. If you want to usher in the presence of God, stop judging your children.
Yeah.
Stop beating up on. If you want to usher in the presence of God, do what Jan and Dan do. Show up at somebody's church unexpectedly and love somebody that you haven't been hanging out with. Go across the bridge and love somebody different. if you want the presence of God if you want to usher in the presence of God. I'm sorry, Jen, you can see I'm very passionate about this topic of humanity and community and authentic spirituality.
Well, you need to stop apologizing. You can preach it, talk about it, discuss it. But where people are in community, there is God. I mean,
Yeah.
that is what I heard you say.
Yes. Yes. And let me tell you, this church proved it. This church proved it. This church is called Glide Memorial Church in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. And so of course evangelicals, Dan, conservatives say, oh, they're liberal, they're heretics or whatever. But let me tell you what they do. They're in the middle. They were in the middle. That this church grew into a mega church in the Tenderloin district, which at one time was one of the worst crack soaked communities in America. And so they had drug addicts, prostitutes, drug dealers living all around the church. And what they would do on Thursday nights, they would do what they call storytelling night. And they would let anybody, a woman could have just turned a trick on the street, but if she wanted to come in and tell her story, they will let people come in and tell their stories. And the pastor says that is how people got set free from drugs. And that he said it was the experience of getting to tell your story and be heard, which is to be treated as a human being, to have someone listen to you and value your story and is to be treated like a human being. And that was like having a deliverance service, Dan. There was no talk of demons. There was no talk of laying on of hands. Just listening to people. Set them free. And
That's
they
awesome.
built authentic community. So you would go to that church and you on a Sunday morning and you would see rich folks and poor folks and former prostitutes and former drug dealers like in worship together, and nobody cared how anybody looked. They were just together where they felt alive and they felt human. Yes.
Yep.
Glide Memorial Church in San Francisco.
And is that the name of that book, No Hiding Place?
No Hiding Place. Yes.
Oh my gosh. I got to get that book.
Yes. Because it's an invitation to say there's a place where you don't have to hide anymore, because that's part of what breaks community is when we feel like we've got to hide because we feel shame and guilt. And so this church was like, we love you unconditionally. Come and tell your story and we will listen as if we have all the time in the world. And in the telling of their story, people were set free from addictions. Yeah. So powerful. Yeah.
The power of openness is so profound.
Yes.
We actually are able to just be authentic and real and not have to hide anything. And that is something that is in the Word. I mean, it's there.
It's in the Word.
I mean, now I know this sounds, but it's so graphic in the Word. Right. It's so graphic that the whole purpose in the New Testament, Paul says, is to have a circumcised heart. Now, the God used circumcision to reveal this is so graphic. I mean, he's so real. What is more, shall I say, important to a man than what gets circumcised when you're 8 days old or whenever they do the circumcision? But that covers up the most sensitive part of a man's body. So when we have a circumcised heart, it's taking off that covering off of our heart. That's all he's trying to point it out. And I don't know why he used one of the most, how could I say, real, to the point examples, where it's like if you uncover that most sensitive part of your body, that's what I want you to do. And you don't have to be afraid, because I'm not going to hurt you. But we all have had trauma, and so we don't want to be exposed, or we will think people don't love us or don't like us. And I have been in so many times where it's when the people do become authentic and say exactly what's real and how they feel, that the most amazing healing occurs. And nobody wants to throw them out of the room. They want to hold them and hug them and say, thank you for being so real. Because I think we're craving that. And not to say it's just society as a whole doesn't focus on that. It focuses on the outside appearance. And so I know this is where the psychology and the spirituality marry, because at some point, the open heart reveals me in the spirit, which is attached to God. And that does have an effect. If I start, like what you were saying, Robert, then understanding who I really am, a child of God, and I believe that, it will change my thinking. I still have got a lot of bad thinking in my head, but I begin to say, I don't want to. I don't want to live in that closed negativity, the hard-heartedness. Um, that it's all over the scriptures that it's the hardness of their heart, and God unfortunately can't unharden people's heart. That has to be happening inside of a person. And Jan, that's what you do at your work, Robert. What you do at your work is, I would assert that all of us are at some point trying to reach the hearts of other people and say, "Can we please love one another? I need to have you as my friend
Jan
and
and
not
I,
my enemy."
Jan and I are like physicians of the soul, and we help people to heal so that community can flourish. That's
Yeah.
essentially, we help people to heal from the inside out so that they can participate in flourishing community. And flourishing community means that no matter how broken you are, no matter where you're from, no matter your color, no matter your religion, no matter your gender, you're part of a community where you're valued and affirmed as a human being. And when that happens and people are part, that's flourishing community. But the work has to begin inside, and so it's the psychology, the therapy, the people who can help us look at ourselves as if we're not ourselves.
In order for that to happen, there has to be psychological safety. I wouldn't advise people to be their authentic selves to just anywhere or anyone,
Of course not.
because you
Yeah.
can be rewounded all over again. And
Mhm.
so that psychological safety within a community is everything.
Yeah.
That you can feel free to speak and you won't be judged, you won't be attacked, you won't, you can be free. And also just teaching what it means to be authentic.
Yeah.
For us, when I speak about being authentic, it's not like kids especially will think, well, not just kids. Kids and adults. I work with both, all, and they're just kind of all in the same boat. I've had adults say, well, I think it's so. I'm just going to say it. That's my truth. Regardless of what the impact is on the other person. Being authentic is really being. It's not just thinking something and then vomiting on people. It's really identifying what's happening for me in the moment in the heart. What am I feeling? What am I needing? And expressing from the heart. And that's a whole different thing than just, you know, if I think it, I'm just going to say it.
Mhm.
But
What people call truth telling. Being a truth teller doesn't mean you're being authentic. I mean,
Yeah.
you can be a person who, I just tell people the truth, and all you're doing is just spouting truth from an intellectual. That's not authenticity. Comes from your own heart.
Yeah, and the truth according to who?
Or the truth according to who, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
authenticity has nothing about people. And I hate when people say, I keep it real. No, you're not. You're judgmental and controlling, and you're angry, and you need counseling. You're not keeping it real. Keeping it real is to say, I don't know, or I'm afraid right now, or I'm insecure right now, or I don't want to answer that question. That's just what for right now. That's being in touch with yourself and having the courage to present whatever part of yourself that you feel comfortable sharing in the moment.
And the struggle is with the culture, boys are not supposed to feel, don't cry. Girls, it hasn't really shifted a whole lot from when I was growing up. Girls are supposed to be pretty and just be nice. So the culture is just so, these things really need to be taught specifically. what is it that we're so disconnected from how we really feel and what it is that we're really needing in the moment. And so to even think about feelings and needs, I've told a few people in my life, professionally and personally, you know what? If you feel, I promise you won't die. I promise you won't die. You know, we think that if we identify and discuss feelings, it's gonna all get into emotional dysregulation, all this stuff. But I liken it to, you're walking in a closet, you need to find something to wear, and the lights are out. So you can't see a thing to pick out to wear. So you turn on the lights, and it's like, oh, where's that sweater? Okay. Well, feelings, that's what it brings clarity when you stop and pause and identify really what you're feeling and what you need. I teach skills like how do we separate the facts of the event
From
from
how we feel about it.
yes, how we interpret it, how we judge it, what we've assumed about it. Those are not facts. Those are things that keep the conflict zone going. So identify what actually happened that can be picked up on a video, the actual event. Then how did I feel about that event? If I say, oh, I feel that, you're immediately going into a thought. You're going into your head. But for myself, I've been in my head for so long that often I will have to bring out a feeling chart for myself to really identify how I feel. And then what is it that you're really valuing and needing? And then be explicit about that. And that kind of conversation really de-escalates things. But I have to tell a funny story. I was traveling with my sister and her daughter's 9-year-old son. He's like my favorite 9-year-old. But he was just in the back seat, and we were stopped in traffic. There was a lot of frustrating things about the traffic. We were trying to get to see his cousin in Dallas, who's very close. He's very close to. But he sat in the back seat, and he's just getting frustrated because we just were stopped. And he asked a question. He goes, "Why can't it just always be about me?" Out of the mouth of a 9-year-old. Why can't it just always be about me? And I'm like, well, Logan. I think his mom and my sister were like, they didn't know quite what to say. And I'm like, well, listen, you know what? What you need and what you feel is really important. But also, it's really important what the other people around you, what they feel and need too. And that is the compassionate thinking, the just the way to go about compassion, because it is about loving self while you're loving the other too. So these things, we don't talk about them. We just expect everybody to get along. We say, let's just love each other without really having a specific conversation about what does that actually mean.
So, Robert, we talked tonight about relationship transformation, which is really something that happens in the heart over time, many times, our whole lifetime. It seems like I sometimes feel I'm just getting started, but it's something we've been working on for years. And then resurrection, because in the transformation, at the end of this all is a very powerful word, and that is resurrection. And this whole thing that we are in the middle of right now, this week, the Christian church has a certain liturgy they've developed over the centuries. That the Hebrew week is the Passover week, where the Passover lamb was sacrificed, and then the whole Feast of Unleavened Bread occurred, and then the wave offering. And this all pictures of the Messiah, of course. So I'd like to ask you
perspective.
What's that?
I said, from a Christian perspective, I have to say that because I have some Jewish friends who would be deeply offended if we interpret all of that as.
Yes, I understand. Yeah. But my view is looking at it, those are all pictures of what Yeshua was.
Absolutely. Yes.
So my question to you, because it's a big issue, the one thing that differentiates Christians is that they believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. If Jesus wouldn't have been raised from the dead, all of his teachings would have been wonderful, but I doubt if they would have survived 2,000 years. Maybe they would have. But the fact is, his resurrection was so profound and so impacting to the history of the world and to the universe. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on the resurrection.
So, so number one is I do believe in the resurrection. I believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus, and that is a. But I don't. But my belief in that is not about for me. I've transcended religion on that. So for me, the resurrection of Jesus is about what does it mean? Okay, that's the question. So what? As one of my theology professors put to me, he says, one great way to interpret the great doctrines of the church is always ask, so what? So you believe in the resurrection. So how does that change what kind of husband you are, what kind of father you are, what kind of person you are in the community? So resurrection for me gives me courage to engage in restorative practices.
How does that
There's
work?
a
That's
connection.
awesome.
There's a connection because whenever I engage in restorative practice, I am practicing the biblical concept of love. So I have on here, Rob Simon quoted this. He gave us that word, and that's a word I've used throughout my ministry, Ubuntu, which is an African word that means because we are, I am. In other, the young man said, "Why can't it always be about me?" And to be honest with you, when I stand up to preach on Sunday mornings, most of my people, at least that's where we begin in that place. And hopefully the message moves us to a place of community where we're not just concerned about ourselves, but we're concerned about each other and community. Restorative practice is building community. Well, that takes courage because you're risking your hearts. You could possibly risk your physical life if it's a dangerous situation. But what gives me the courage to put my heart at risk is that I believe that in resurrection power, so that if I get hurt, if somebody does betray me, if I end up devastated by deep betrayal, God is able to resurrect my heart and resurrect my hope so that I can keep loving and keep being in a relationship. That's why, that's one of the reasons the resurrection is important. The resurrection is important. It gives me the courage to engage in restorative practices on a social level in the community so that single mothers who are struggling for food, like to put my church and put my life at risk to help these people with the confidence that if we lose temporarily, God, the resurrection power will restore us to life and enable us to keep living and keep loving. So that's why I dig into the resurrection more on a what does it mean basis, and how does it change how we live our lives and how does it help us to engage. And so, Jan, I'm just saying this to you. What you and Rob, the work you do of restorative practice, if you read the gospel carefully, if you read the gospels that's exactly the work that Jesus was doing. How do you redeem, restore, reconcile, heal, and build healthy community?
Wow. Amen.
That is the journey. That is
The
the
journey.
journey.
That's the journey.
And
Dan,
I'm,
can I tell you the first time I saw it? The first time I saw it was not in a church, Jan. The first time I experienced authentic community, and I saw people being authentic individuals, and I saw them engaging in as a community, not as experts, but as just lay people engaging in restorative practice, both for themselves and others, was in an AA group. I was pastoring a church, and there was a group they were members of my church, and they said, "Pastor, you need to come to an AA group." And I went, and I sat there with my mouth open because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And these people were coming in, and there were no guards up. They knew it was a safe place. Number one, Jan, that's what you were talking about. They knew they were in a safe place, and they went around and they checked in on every person. And however long it took for each person to say how they were doing, the group waited for them. And when they finished, they all gave the same response. Hey, good to see you. Glad you're doing well. Glad you're here today. And then they would go to the next person. And then they would talk about, and I was like, and it clicked in my mind. Oh my God, this is what the church is supposed to be. This is what church is supposed like. I never knew that, Jan. I never knew that. I thought church was about shouting and jumping up and down and proclaiming the doctrine and the getting people saved and all. But all of that is surface language to talk about what's really going on, and it's this restorative work. God is a God of redemption. He is doing restorative practice, and God wants us to engage in that work with God, alongside God, and be agents of that work in our wherever we go. And Jan, you're doing it. You and Dan are doing the work, the restorative practice. You are doing the work of the kingdom. And what's so beautiful about it, and this is always true, the people who are really doing kingdom work, they very seldom know that that's what they're doing. And the people who have spoke prophetically to me had no idea they were being prophetic. They were speaking directly into my life, into my issues, into what was going on with me that very day. They didn't have a clue. They had no idea. All
You
they
know that word, faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. That the hearing the word is the word rhema, which is different than the word logos
Yeah.
in the Greek. So rhema is a spoken word, and so it says in the scripture, God has spoken to us in many places and many times. I personally believe in the feast days, he speaks to us through those pictures.
Yes.
I've studied a great deal about the constellations in the heavens, and many people believe that those reveal a story that was put up there a long time ago, thousands of years ago. And that story is God speaking to us in those pictures. So it's a very interesting study. But then he speaks through each other, and that's back to the resurrection. If, in fact, he rose from the dead, and then when he ascended, he gave gifts unto men, it says, and that his spirit lives within us now. As wild as that sounds, that I have him living in me in the spirit. He is in me, a token of what is to happen in the future, apparently. So then, when we're walking in the spirit in love, we can have a humongous impact on the world, because it's like, not to be arrogant, but it's like I am his representative wherever I go. And so if it's no matter if it's in a church or if it's in a wherever, sitting here at Friends University, these three young men I worked with and just visited with, man, it was so rich, just the little bit of time we were together. So I'm excited. I think the change
I
that
think
we can bring in,
the vineyard.
what's that?
I think what you do at the vineyard, for all for all practical purposes, what you do at your vineyard is more kingdom work than what most churches have ever dreamed of.
Well, I don't know about that. I do know this.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. I assure you, sir. I assure you. Trust me. And so, if you relate what you're doing not to how we typically think of church, like that stuff enriches the institution of church. I'm talking about the people work, which
Yeah.
another word for that is restorative practice. There is more restorative practice that takes place at your vineyard that has happened in churches in hundreds of years.
Well, and I have to say that our general manager at Prairie Hill Vineyard, he is full of grace, full of mercy. I mean, his whole family has stepped in whenever he needs anybody. They are there, and it's been amazing to watch just the service approach of the people that are running the vineyard. So I totally agree, Dan. You may not see it as much because you're humble, but I do see kingdom work. That just even the respite that people feel just walking on the
Exactly. Yes.
There's that verse.
Cultivating joy. You're
I
cultivating
and peace.
connection. You're
Yes.
cultivating
Yeah.
community and flourishing of relationships. That's what God wants.
Yeah. I was out in the vineyard the other day pruning, And so the whole verse of scripture keeps coming to my mind every time I go out to the vineyard. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you abide in me and I abide in you, you will bear much fruit. For without me, you can do nothing. Now, that's a pretty big statement. Without me, you can do nothing. But the whole heart of that, as I see, is that when we allow his spirit to work within us, and all of us can, if we choose to, then he gets his work accomplished in us. And without that, what am I really doing? If I'm just working for me, it's not much. It's nothing. Without me, you can do nothing. It's not going to have any major life changing long term impact. So when he's saying doing nothing, it's like, yeah, I can do a lot of stuff, but it doesn't amount to much. It's the impact we have in love for others that is his kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. So I'm so excited about what we're all going to be able to see happen. I think the change, Jan, that we want to see in the world will begin with us, and we'll take it from there, day at a time. We have some of the most wonderful people we can interview, and all of us working together, I think we'll develop a community of people that may not be millions, but if we can have 5 or 10, that would be awesome, that we were in close community with. And maybe it would be 5,000 or 50,000. If God's doing his work all over the country in many people's lives, it can't be just you doing it or me doing it. It's all of us doing this together. And there's so many people I want to talk to that aren't in the church. Because if they're already in church, it's not like, okay, what about those people that are just so upset because of past church experience? Or like this young man who was sitting here, he's not really a Christian. He's not sure what he wants and all that. I'd much rather hang out with him than with somebody that thinks they know it all and just learn from him. So I'm excited about that.
So next week, we're going to have as a guest Ben Mitchell. He has been a colleague and dear person in my life, a mentor in many ways. He probably laughed. He heard me say that. It's probably gone back and forth. But where we met was he was the assistant principal at West High, where I was a school psychologist. And he was right there with me when I started the restorative practices. I brought Rob on, and Ben, it was who he was already. And then he just like me did some shifts and changes. And then he's done many things within Wichita Public Schools. He's been the principal at Southeast High School. He's now going to be the principal at an alternative school, Gateway. But he's also going to support the hearing office in kids who've really had some troubles and be more restorative, do some restorative practices. And so he's going to be here next week just to share about his view of leadership in the community, concerns about young people, how we can better promote schools in a connected community. So I'm excited about that. The following week, we're going to have some real visionaries. Kathy Grant, 25 years ago, had a vision about getting instruments and music in the hands of students that could not ordinarily get extra support, extra lessons and instruments at home to practice and all kinds of things like that. So she's got a team of people that are working on Music Youth Partnership. So she and the director, Claire Woody, are going to join us the following week. And then the week after that, I have Jim Yoder lined up, and he is an expert personally and professionally on all the aspects of suicide. There's just Kansas, and across the country, suicide has escalated. It has also escalated recently in the African American community too. I mean, just across the board, it's just been a heartbreaking situation. So we'll have him. We have a good friend of mine. He's not going to be speaking until later on in July, but he is the founder and director of Next Elements in Newton and has written all kinds of books has a book coming out on compassionate accountability. We just have all kinds of cool topics and people. And I just love the focus of this podcast. Everyday people doing extraordinary things.
Yes.
We have a lot of things going outside of here of people really wanting to promote what we're wanting to promote, bridging the gap, building bridges of understanding rather than walls and fences. And so I really want to be sensitive to people who have been wounded by Christianity, by the culture of Christianity, and by the church. I want to hear, invite some people on that have really suffered some spiritual abuse, because I feel like the church, we can do a better job of listening and hearing and then making some changes based on that. So we got a really bright future ahead, a lot of interesting conversations of healing with a healing focus.
Absolutely.
That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, I know, Pastor, you got to get to your service.
Yep.
Have a great resurrection weekend.
Hey, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
And something I want to leave us with, Phil Stacy ended our podcast last week with shock people with love. I just love that. I think about that every day. How can I shock people with love? And
Yeah.
that really is a focus.
That's restorative practice.
It is.
Restorative practice. That's a great concept. I hope my hope and my prayer, if I can say that, is that we lean into that, and that we learn, that we will, in spite of the spiritual abuse that has happened in the church from in all kinds of ways, nothing we can do about it, just like we can't do. But what we can do is present a new vision of what the church is supposed to be. And that's the best way for people to heal, is for them to see, okay, just because I had a bad experience over there, that doesn't mean that's who the church is. Because the church is really about restorative practice. And wherever that's happening, even if it's not under the label of Christian, that we can trust that it is right and it is good, and that people can flourish in that kind of environment. Yeah.
Really find purpose, meaning, community, love, all the things that Dan's been talking about for years.
Yeah.
That's what Jesus was talking about. I mean, all we're really doing is representing him. That way, when they say the church is, and the church is made up of people, and people can get really wacky. But part of this whole thing is the Messiah. We can't. This whole thing is about the reality of his resurrection living within us, and it's changed the history of this world and the one to come. The resurrection was probably, in my opinion, the most profound event in all of human history. It has never happened before, and it only will happen again, I guess, when he comes back, and we're going to get new bodies fashioned like to his glorious body. That hope in me just blows my mind. The very fact that it says that, it's like, whoa, that's the wildest picture I could imagine, is that I would have a resurrected body like the one that he got up in. But that's what it says. So I'm excited. I'm looking forward to the future in the long term.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, good night, everybody, and have a wonderful Easter. We'll talk to you all down the road.
Hold on. Yep. We're going to play our song. I will see you all next week.
Okay. Have a great week, everyone.
Drive away from here. Smile for what you know. Bittersweet to a brand new future. Eyes on the road. Don't carry burdens that no one uses. Don't even measure the time. Pages worn out verses.